Suck at singing right now. Oh, look at this, guys. Setting some stuff up real quick. Oh, pop that neck, guys. Oh yeah. My life is real interesting at times. 'Cause I'm just a thought. I gotta set it up where I can do that. I don't know how to do it. Hey babe. What you doing?
Coming in here to chill.
Okay. Yeah. Food, guys. Baby, that's adorable. Huh? Yeah. Some of the noise, my voice might bounce out to the hall today. Trying to be a little bit more sound conscious. What? No, put it over. To me, it's pretty true in here. I think. You're playing with him just now?
No. Just started panting.
Huh?
No, he just started panting.
Oh. It's excitement though. All the hype. Dog gets too hype.
Yep. So much excitement. Too much crap.
Can't stop the hype.
There's such hype. Much crap.
You got your computer up?
Yep.
That's fun.
Yep.
It's really good.
You're welcome.
I really like the sauce.
Yeah.
Demon was away. Don't forget, you're just another slave. Dreamer, let my heart away. Daydreamer, what's your what's with this? My dreamer, dreamer, not away. Should I continue to do the main? Yeah, or should I just?
Oh, and plus, let's see what weird shit shows up.
I would love to say the weird shit gonna show up, babe, but
You got more elders.
it's true. Ancient but fresh. Tomatoes red as magma. Gotta give us some magma.
Tomato!
The tomatoes.
The tomato!
The Tontatos.
The Tapatos.
The Papados.
The
The Papados.
Papatos.
Yes, the Papados.
The Papatos.
You're so loud compared to me right now.
I know it's going playing with the dog and I
But I think I'm actually making my mic. When I actually do talk loud enough, it sounded like it just hit the pitch or peak. It peaked out. I was like, what the hell? Bum, bum, bum. I just want my gear.
How dare you?
All the gear. Ooh, energy drink. Nice. Bum, 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 bum. Stared in the flames long enough to burn away most of my sight, but I still can't hold a candle to the Wyverian wizard he does. So what are we hammering together this time? This guy is so weird. Can I upgrade any equipment? That'd be amazing. The Magna Manus. Ooh, what's this? What thing I unlocked? The Dragon Bone Cutter 3. Almost said 2, but joke's on you. Elder Dragon Blood. Okay, cool. You need to scalp these guys. Guys, scalp me. Bum 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 bum. Just a little bit. I don't know. Oh, it says search the ancient forest for tracks. Search the wild spare waste for tracks. Okay, cool.
How much I love this dog?
Do you love this dog?
Yeah, look at him.
I don't tell me that.
Look at him.
Oh, he's adorable. He's just laying on you.
He's slowly sliding. Oh my god.
It's because he's slowly making his escape. Duh. Mama, side. What was this? Oh, it's alcohol. Heat, medium, what is this? Foodie? Food effect remains active even after you faint in battle. Ooh. Shows health to allies in the area upon fainting. Okay. Stands on invulnerability period when you're getting out. Alright. We will take it. Why? Because I have no clues. Yeah, I forgot how to do it. My bad. My brain. My brain's idled. Today's just been tiring.
Yeah.
In some way, some shape, it's just been tiring. The decision to run to the door on D&D was...
That was a wild one. That was something else.
It was wild, but like we're out of like options, and I didn't think about these sliding doors because what glass doors or sliding doors are in the world. And then I thought about Tomb Raider, and then it's sideways.
I don't think about a stone door just sliding sideways.
Marcus a freaking thing, okay? And I don't have perception enough to look at things half the time.
When your perception's too low.
I didn't know it would be that big of a deal. Because I still got perception, like, passive perception. We're only ones all the time. It sucks.
Dog agreed.
What's that?
Even the dog agreed. He sneezed when you said that. Your stream turned into a mukbang.
What?
Your stream turned into a mukbang.
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 Hey, working hard. What's that? You heard me mumbling? Yeah, the chief asked me to rustle up some ingredients for him. No. Yum yum yum. Ooh, thanks, you're a lifesaver. We fivers gotta look out for each other, eh?
Oh.
Well, here are the details. Good luck. I think I'll do like one mission on here.
Okay.
And then I'll switch a card real quick.
I feel like you get more of beer on pod.
I definitely do. What? Someone yells at me for yelling at COD.
Yep. Yes, we do. But this is your celebratory stream, so you can play anything you want, and I can get mad at you. Except Doki Doki. Not for Doki.
Why not?
I
To
will
play
not
Getting
agree to
Over
that.
It.
You
How
can
about
play
that?
Getting Over It. I don't care about that. Doki Doki, that's out of the realm. I'm not allowing that in this household.
Why?
There's enough psychological problems here.
I mean, there's plenty of psychological problems. I couldn't stand her staring at you. Like, staring at John, staring at me. Like, you know? I was just like, she's gonna blink anytime soon? Like, it's a computer game and
Freaking you out. Freaky.
it wasn't even her. What she was saying was like bad. Like she's like, "Oh, I know you're recording this." So she's like, "Hi, everybody who's watching." I was like, "Okay, I got you. I can see you."
Brown nail polish sucks.
I mean, what do you want to know? So I'll tell you right now, I don't wear brown nail polish.
Shitty, don't do it. Literally and figuratively. This figurative is Thanksgiving like, so I'm doing it.
Yeah. Well, if you get a really good brown, that's more like a maroon. Might be that not bad.
More like a burgundy then.
Thank you. But still.
Well, shitty.
Point made. Point made.
I made a mistake.
When do you not?
It's true.
Yeah, take that, guys. I'm here to fuck stuff up. Make sure you're ready for it. Oh yeah. Let's go, dude. Why is that one running away? Oh, is there Yager coming? I just realized there's this big thing here. Log. I don't usually run over here. Oh, nothing really good back here in
You were so
this.
stuck on story mode that like you didn't really explore and do anything else.
I mean, we explored. We just didn't explore to like. It was like a big spot. Like it was just behind the log. That the Yagers, not was it the Yagers or the Davaho destroy. But I've also noticed, like, as we've been doing the missions, we've also had more areas of the map open up to us. That's why it's harder to explore too. So.
Should I do my nails dark purple for fall?
I'm gonna call that fall, but
Or like burgundy and dark purple,
sure.
fall assorted colors. Oh shit! I gotta go in my bedroom then,
Why?
because I don't want to stink up this room with acetone.
Well, the door's open.
Unless you want me to.
I'm fine with it right now. I'm so tired right now that it'll probably wake me up a bit. Guys, freaking amazing D&D game. You took that on level 7. It's freaking amazing. Man, it actually feels nice to get back to Monster Hunter. Watch this awesome parkour skills. What are you gonna do about that? You can't fight that. No, you can't. It's gonna happen. I'm gonna jump up in your face and slice up your tail. That's what I was gonna say. Tail. Ooh, Rathalos scale, nice. Not what I needed, but I'll take it anyways. Let's see. We're looking around for those Windswept, like the blueprints, because those are actually part of my mission. Probably find it faster if I actually did quest. High ranking quest. That seems to be the theme every time. Bam! You guys got clapped. Did that my combo. I was just killing things. I wasn't collecting them. I forgot I could collect them. Oh. Nice, Yagras Hide Plus. There's a lot of squeaking going on. I apologize, guys. You just gotta hold on. My dog will eventually stop. One day. My doggo. Hope people enjoy seeing my corgi. He's freaking adorable. You can't say no to my corgi. Come on. Yeah, come on. Seriously? Can't say no unless you're a cat person, and then it's special. Ooh, bone pile. We're gonna collect all the bone pile. The boom boom boom. Put some boom in your boom 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 and in it and the arms. Yeah. Dun 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 dun. Come on, run faster. Let's go. Got places to be, things to do. I need to sharpen my weapon real quick. I don't know how that happened, but it happened when my weapon sharpness dropped. Look at all the Yagras. Apparently can only carry 5 honey. It's kind of sad. Ooh, this is Magdagora. Magdagora, you use it for a lot of potions. It's high level potions. Ones that will give you better strength or defense. Ooh, Bugga Trappers. Doodles. Doodles Toodles. My poodles. Oh, gotta get it. Oh, the dog squeaking. After those prints, they're everywhere. What, babe? No, I won't give you this. Got dragons flying around. Alright?
Dragons.
Dragons.
All the dragons.
All the dragons.
I'll
Appreciate it. Rathalos crashes. Cautious. That's nice. We stay away with your big one. I'm guessing it's Rathalos. Yep, I was right. Can it go that way? Interesting little Doodles, right? I've been pretty mad at COD lately. Kind of the reason why I wanted a break. But I will probably play it later. So I'm a sucker! Oh no! Oof. Should have died, right? Wrong! This is Monster Hunter World. I'm 10 times stronger than a normal human. I can take fall damage like there's no other business. Okay, I really thought we could have kept falling in the river there, but I might just back out because I'm not finding any more windswept. Black gashes are just gashes in general. I mean, not in general, but for the higher elder level monsters. Because the highest levels. Oh, look. Found prints, nice. Oh, almost there. Hey, all the damages. No, dude. I don't have that. I can't remember now. My brain just forgot how to slide. Oh yeah, you just run and it goes downhills. I was thinking it's like COD, and I'm sitting here putting C, so you can see my target. I hate those guys. But man, it's gonna be a pretty good night, you know. Sit here and chill. I'm gonna freaking whack these guys until the next century. I freaking hate them. They'll just sit here and poke you and whatnot. Oh, why is he still alive? I thought I killed him. Oh, there he goes. No, he's probably still alive. Boom. Yeah, there you go. Come on, guys. Do this shit. This guy's sharper one weapon again. Why not, you know? It's totally innocent. Oh, I can't take it. What? Oh, crap. Does Angela have behind me? Yes, leave this item. Can I leave it, please? That'd be nice. Come on. Alright. Yes. There? Okay. Oof. I don't know why. It was being a pain in the butt. Okay, the Andrath is following me, but it's not really doing anything to me. It's really weird. It's just yelling at me. Get out of my swamp! My swamp, fool. Oh, my stamina. Oh well. Come on, let's go. He's probably still following me. No, he's not. Okay. There he goes. Now my mouse shows up. I was like wondering. I was like, come on, man. There you go. Pick up some hands for that. Oh, that's Toadstool. Don't need Toadstool. You like a punk with a big old punk? That's a big old bagger wasp. Dude, will you hold still, man? I want to shoot you. I don't got anything to shoot you with, though. Dang it. Come on, guys. Come here. I want to fight you. Fight me! Fight me! Oh, look. I found Boosta. It says Pukey old toxic mucus. But that's weird. Threat level? Whoa. He's super threat level? Rage threat level? What are we doing? Pukey is gonna kick my butt. That's what's gonna happen. I don't know why it was put mucus there and then. Is he even on my map? I forget how to get to the map without. Shut up, okay. So used to playing COD now. It's not trying to find things. It's crazy. I can't find Pukey on the map right now. I find these guys. There's a Great Yagras somewhere. I don't care about the Great Yagras. Oh, nice. He found me an item. Yeah, you know, the more footprints you grab, the more points you have, so it's pretty cool. Singing and us back around. Keep trying to slide. We can hop and jump and roll, but not slide. Unless you're going downhill. Then it's a different matter. Oh, see. Oh, we almost got it. Almost got it. Yeah, slide the home base. Whoop, 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 whoop. Nick Monstro Colony. By the way, babe, but how's my sound? By the way, I didn't ask. Oh, nice. That works. Yeah, but I was asking how my sound was though. Babe. Bob. Do I need to talk louder? Sound is good, but lighting is dark. Yeah. I kind of made it on purpose, to be honest. We can double check. Maybe stuff has changed. Because I moved the lights over here, and it made me like pale looking. I was like, what's going on? Let's see. Filters. Color correction. We'll bring the gamma back a little bit. Lighten up the tad. Well, now you look orange. I mean, I'm using an orange light too. I was trying to get like a little bit of a tan looking, but it'll look completely pale. Not because I care, but that's my skin color. It's tan. Oh, freaking ish. Oh, God. Someone put a pickle in my mouth because I need food. No, I'm kidding. I ate already. It's jokes. Don't take it serious. But, babe, I was asking if the mic sounded fine. Like, are you actually enjoying listening to my mic's audio right now? Eat? Me? I don't know how to eat. Confused. And you. Is it weird that my background music or my music cuts out whenever I talk? That's a good question too. Wondering if I find another woman. It's just a little suspicious. What's this way? It's so low I hardly noticed it in the first place. Okay. What is this way? Okay, interesting. Just random back one. Yo, what's up, Saito? Bro, what's going on, man? How's your night? The Sean. We were playing some Monster Hunter, trying to find those, Elder Dragon, markings. I'm a freaking brain fart right now. It's like, what? A non-existent brain right now. How's your night going, though? How's it been? We've been freaking hailing over here, raining all day. Our house is actually down to like 73 degrees without the heater on. Sounds bad. I'm gonna just finish a short video from my stream tonight and now I'll chill before bed. Nice. And put you to sleep. Listen to my soothing voice. There's a flower bed over here. Yeah, it's freaking wild. That's hailing in Phoenix. Oh yeah, I told you on stream. You almost done with Code Vein, by the way? I feel like you've been playing for a bit. I bought the new stream for a little bit before we DG. Oh. Ooh, Gold Bloom. Nice. Pressure flower from the forest. It glitters brighter than gold. Unbelievable. Alright, tell them the news. Ooh, what happened in D&D? Does Sean want to know what happened in D&D? Nice D&D is always great. A little bit suspicious. I don't know if he wants to know. Oh, what? Why did I just target something? I think so. I'm not sure, honestly, but feels like it. I think it's awesome. I enjoy D&D a lot. Now, if people make it hard to play with, it sucks a little bit, but it's been worse. There we go. I'm always down for D&D news. Alright. So we're in a dungeon. We're struggling. We're trying to get this Hobgoblin dead. It's a level 3. We're all level 1s. They're all pretty fairly new to the game. One person who had like some Pathfinder experience. And then that was it. That was all. That was the group. So our DM is just, you know, like helping us along a little bit, just like letting us explore, letting us stumble over stuff. And this Hobgoblin would not die. We were struggling, and then we finally beat him. Well, get good. What's good? What's good about the story is we run into a bunch of goblins and a goblin shaman. By the way, he's showing like one goblin for like 4 goblins, and there's at least a good 10 of these groups just scattered around the dungeon. And we're like, okay, how are we supposed to do this? I'm a freaking rogue, so I go stealth. I roll a 28 for my stealth, alright? So I walk in and I search the whole dungeon, and this is how I know there was that many goblins, because I could see them all. So we were like, okay, what are we gonna do? Sam's like, hey, let's leave, and I was like, you know, let's do them one by one. We'll fight the groups one by one, you know, we got it. We got this. Will be fine. And our DM's like, you know, if you lure them though, because they might come over and attack you, so you might bite off more than you chew. And I was like, okay, well, Sam uses her fart, and that's when it gets trolly. He's trolly. Let's say that, right? Like 40 of them. Well, yeah, there was like, no, it was like 10 groups, I swear. Anyways, so he gets trolly. Sam farts, clears the dungeon, well, covers the dungeon with this fog fart. And, we have our barbarian, who's a snake, like beast, right? So he wraps the shaman up, pulls him away, and then we just sat there whacking him. And the shaman was so weak, he couldn't break away from the wrap. So we were just beating him, and the barbarian was just holding him while we were beating him the whole entire time. On top of it, we found out at the end of it, he's a level 7, had 92 something health, and we just leveled up too. We just beating the game. My DM's like, I thought there might be a possibility you guys got through this, but like I was hoping you guys would just run away, and we would just come back later and do this. I was pelting him with pebbles the whole entire time. Yeah, Sam's a druid. She's a halfling too. She's sitting there patting with them pebbles, you know. She's literally like, he's like, hey, you know, roll for your hits, right? So he had him do it twice because he can throw 2 pebbles, right? Thanks. Throw pebbles twice. So she had to roll twice. She got 12 and 12. 2 times. And then, like, she goes to roll for damage, and I think her best one was maybe like 8. That's all she got. So she's dying, laughing because she's like, I'm not really doing anything, but I'm just gonna sit here and keep petting him. I'm just gonna keep petting him. It's like, all right, I guess that works, you know. And then yeah, we finally took him out though. It was freaking nuts. It's like, how did we get to this point? Our DM has like 90 items he had to roll for, and then on top of it, he has to go and name all the items. And we got like a bunch of gold and stuff. It was ridiculous. We just leave it in. And Sean, guess what? I don't know what Sean's supposed to be catching, Sam. You didn't tell me. He's like, what? Alright, I think I'm gonna leave this expedition because I haven't found any other marks yet. Ties. Oh, I figured he would figure it out if he just looked up and saw the subscription side. I was like, woohoo! I was like all excited because I popped in Sean's chat and it's like month 5 of thanks. I'm pretty sure, bro. I'm like, damn. Party. This is freaking amazing, dude. I mean, I did, but it didn't process. Oh, you saw it, but you didn't. Yeah. It's like when you're watching other people's channels. I feel like there's so many people who are able to, are already affiliates already. Yeah, that's what the word I was looking for. Let's see. I saw the button and was like, ah, was that always there? I can freaking see your face. Calling that. Just looking at it. Oh. I'm gonna die. But congrats nonetheless. Thanks, bro. Appreciate it. I bet you were super excited when you hit that mark. You're like, oh my god, I can just come. Thank you, man. Proud of you, dude. How are you feeling, though? Are you feeling any better? No, I'm getting stuffy because we turned the heat on here and made it a little dry. That's what I was gonna do. I forgot. Items can be delivered. What items can be delivered? What are you doing? Boom. All the loves. Yeah, I can't wait, dude. I got these emotes down and stuff, me. I'm so ready. When I first got my mark, I was baffled and immensely happy. You feel it? I'm feeling better, just getting rid of the last one, cold. Okay, well, take it easy. Don't push yourself still. You can always fall back down the rabbit hole. Yeet. Oh, man. I didn't actually click one of these. My bad. Large monster hunt. Why not? Let's see. Get over here. Nope. I was hoping, you know, this guy would figure out this damn monster. So what is it? Monster Filled Guide updated. Raffalo, Great Devo, the Danger Pickle. That's the best one. The Devil Pickle. Doratus, Tobikadachi, Rathlos, Legania, or something. Is there any? I still haven't found enough for the Elder Dragon I was looking for. Guidance to the next track. Oh, okay. One pickle boy. Yeah, he's a danger pickle. Be careful of that danger pickle. This is the one I'm looking for. It's only in the Ancient Forest, so maybe if I go back or do a mission there. Maybe do investigation. That sounds good. I felt like I'm like know everything about this game, but at the same time, like it's still low rank. Or no, higher. Just 2 more months before Iceborne come. I know. I was thinking about it, dude. I was sitting here, I'm like, man, I gotta grind these missions out real quick. But I think what happened. I'm addicted to COD right now. Big addicted to COD. Let's see, available quests. What we got? We got optional quest. A light upon the river's gloom. Can't do that one, but that looks dope. Don't know what that one is, but it looks dope. You can pre-order on Steam if you want. Can't wait for it. I mean, forget a pre-order. That'd be awesome. Yeah, here, let's go help these guys out. No clue where they're at right now. Flourishing mushrooms are going on right now. Okay. And yes, COD. COD is amazing right now. I really like I just like the way it plays and the things you can do and stuff. It's pretty crazy. You got a pre-order when you get back from vacation. Hey, where you going on vacation to? When did I miss this? Ow. The part. Yes, because I'm a dork. Go on. The Anaheim. Oh, that's right. A Kylie dork. Yeah, I forgot about the con. Okay, don't judge me, guys. I'm just trying to live my life here, alright, and try to remember the small things, okay? That's as far as my computer goes. Yeah, no, we talked about meeting up with him. Did we actually remember when life remembers? When you feel like I felt that? Hello. Oh yeah. I'm dying, guys. Alright, so gotta pop this mic out here. I'm going to K-pop. Ooh, K-pop. No, I don't remember when Pepperidge. Oh, someone fainted. Ow, damn. What Pokey are they going up against right now? I didn't pay attention to what level mission this was. A freaking K-pop concert. Who's playing a K-pop pump? K-pop pump. Pop. Yeah, pop. That's right. That's how you say it. You don't say K-pop. You say K-pop. Is make your life better. Ooh. Alright, okay, I was like, wonder where the hell they went to. K-pop. That's what we call it. K-pop. Who's gonna even play K-pop concert? Is BTS gonna be there? Cause, you know, BTS be down, I'll be down there. It'd be like, for my birthday. Gonna party. Let's see. It's Yuki. Ty, what are you doing, man? Put your sword away. That's embarrassing, dude. Wait, what is going on the map right now? These guys are fighting Anjanath. Where's the Pookie at? Okay, well, super confused. Alright, just follow these guys. Yeah, but Sean, let me know who's at gonna be the K-pop concert. Cause I know Sam would die. She'd be like, K-pop. It's probably gonna be the Sam, what's the one girl that says KDA pop? Oop. There's a Pookie. What are you gonna do? It's gonna be Rosalia. Who the hell is Rosalia? He just got his butt kicked. That's interesting. Alright, well, take that. They're from, it's a group. Oh, and they're from 4 different groups. Bum away the world today. I mean, look at this guy. He's got Daddy Bush, Bang Dream. Bang Dream. Seems like a pretty name, you know. I don't know, I have to check him out and see him. I'm not a big K-pop person, to be honest, but I'll watch them. I'm watching all night long. What they call me, a stalker. Why is my stamina and my health down? Oh, you know, I didn't eat before this mission. Dude, somebody save my soul. Well, I'm gonna die. Bang dream. Bang bang dream. Let's see. Climb up here. There's Daddy Bush again. Oh, he's flying off. Okay, well fine. I guess I'll fly off too. Ain't about this life. Go back to the tent real quick. Oh, my back. Guys, have you seen it? It's broken. I took it. Oh. I'm so freaking noob at this game. You think I have... How many hours do we even have on this game? Can't even think. Shake the titties. Shake the titties. Shake the titties. Let's see, hold on. I'm trying to figure my life out right now. Oh, hey. Sean, where did you and your girlfriend go to for your date the other day? Let's see. What you see? I'm surprised I don't have any. I was hoping I had some boost to health, but I don't. I'm gonna go outside. A new Mexican restaurant called Antro and Agave. How was it? Did you enjoy it? Was it enjoyable? Oh, I so thought I was gonna jump on him. So mad. He's in the perfect spot too. No, it won't let me climb that. Yeah, tell me how it was, man. How good was it? I can't imagine having Mexican food in Illinois of all places. I'd be like, yo, this is white people's food. This ain't Mexican. You accidentally click 2 buttons at once. Is it skill? Or are you just a dork? Oh. They probably just used my combo. Oh. Oh, nice. I cut off the... Okay, come on. Just cancel out, Ty. That'd be great. Look, see, I do 100 damage now. It's nice. I feel like I'm a real member of society right now. Oh. Actually, it's really good, really fancy for Bloomington. Okay. Hopefully it lasts as long. I hate to watch restaurants come in and then get their freaking butts taken out because for whatever reason. Alright. Got to do with it. Oh. There we go. Pookie Telt for the win. I got him. I didn't expect to get him that. I didn't get one freaking marking. Strangers. Yo, so lately, Sean, one of my favorite songs to listen to is the Fire Force opening song. The opening song of the Fire Force anime. I don't know if you've been watching Fire Force. It's been freaking dope. Dope. Just take it all. Give it all to me. Got two vulture. Vacha. Hey man, I'm not even talking anymore. You might just leave me alone. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I'm this person. I'm like waiting for it to load, and I forgot to click. I might just switch the card now. Nah, you know, I'm just tired. A tired feeling on a day. I've got to do. Okay, maybe it's also the music part too, because it's just slow. Just slow. Hey, Saito, you can throw something on. I got sound requests on. Just do exclamation mark song request, and then throw whatever link you want to do, man. Pump me up. I need some pump up music right now. I'm about to play some Fire Force opening because I'm a dork. I'm trying to learn the lyrics to it. No, I don't want that. I mean, as much as that'd be cool, I don't want. I hate listening to songs that are Japanese originally dubbed. Like, I will listen to it because, like, it helps me understand what the song's saying, but my brain is like, no, this is not right. I'm not sure at the moment. I'm playing League, listening to JoJo. Ha ha ha. Nice. You playing Senna right now? I'll take that as a yes. What am I hearing? I feel like I'm hearing someone's stream, maybe? Because we don't have much material, is what I just heard. Figure out what's going on. It's weird. It plays like these two songs and then just loses it. Which Fire Force is so great though. Freaking yeah, it is. It's amazing, dude. Oh, dude, party chat? There's party chat? Okay, I was losing my mind here. I was like, I haven't heard party chat in Monster Hunter in forever, dude. I didn't even think about it. I'm sitting here like hearing them talking. Didn't even notice. No, voice chat is push to talk. Cool. It's the Rotten Bell. Anyways. Brain farting over here. And let's see, let's get this done. I want to get this done. And pre-order the Iceborne, bring it in, get the group together, slicing up monsters left and right. You think I'm being freaking crazy, but I'm normal. Just little 5 minutes. Right, I'm so need a new song right now. Babe, save me. Play some songs. What JoJo's got? JoJo's Sweat Transitive. No, forget that already. Maybe you should just skip. Maybe find another song that's nope. Just give me some random crap. Ooh, what's the one with guys, come help me think. It's oh, it's a game. It's like Alan Walker. There you go. I think it's Alan Walker Faded. No, it's not that, but we'll take it anyways. Fade away. I see you. Probably gonna get copyrighted for this song. But did not want to do that. I messed up. Something, dang it. I need a good song. You guys are gonna believe this because you're never gonna see this happen. You never see it again. Come in. Yeah. Rick roll you all day long. Oh yes. Love, so do I. Any other guy understand, I'm gonna lift you up, never let you down, run around, desert you, make you proud, say goodbye, lie, desert you, oh, I'll hurt you, my bad. So long. Again, I'm glad to say it. What? I thought this was. What is my mission here? Alright, well, not that I really cared right now, but quest info, let's go, because I forgot. Okay. Oh, hunt all targets, the Kukulku and the Great Yagras. Oh, okay. I was like wondering, I thought it was the Kukulku, not the Yagras, but Boom! Slap ya. With some firepower. Boom. What are you gonna do about that? Oh no, you're gonna hit me back? Oh, alright, we're going to battle, bro. You better bring it. Oh! Super Saiyan 2000! Someone totally got chat when I said that. Totally messed up my vibe. No. Game we're gonna play it. Understand the you want put you down, run around and desert you. If you found desert you. I killed him already. What the hell? Alright, apparently I'm too strong now. I just kill things by myself. I don't think the Great Yagras was that strength. Yeah, I'm doing like the low level ranks. Oops. Messed up. Supposed to be doing high level things. This mighty brain. That's what I need to do it. I need to do it. Let's see. Alright. What's Cobra gonna be like? Gotta find a and this investigation will be over. Time done. Putting in the work. Gotta make it work. Got so bars that you can't get dark. By this love, because I'm gonna be a bar. I was wondering why he died so quick. It was literally hit him only a few times, and then he was already dead. And then I look at the quest info again. What the heck is a Yakula Cool? Freaking Rock Eater. Hey, Bon, what's going on, man? It's just sitting here playing, you know, Monster Hunter, dude. Running into monsters and stuff, and getting my butt kicked by monsters, you know? How's your day going, bud? Gotta jump away. What time is there? Freaking almost 1 o'clock in the morning. Too early. That's how time it is. How's your day been? You at work right now? If I remember correctly, right? Let's see, where'd they go? I knew he came up this way somewhere. Did he go down? I miss him? Having a haircut at the moment. Nice. Surprised you can hear me. These buzzers are too loud. I got this game, but been meaning to pay, but couldn't. What's that? Let's see, what is it? I haven't played it in a while because I've been addicted to COD, so I decided tonight, since I became affiliate finally, that I'll take a break from COD for a little bit. Which means literally I play one game and then I'll go back to COD. Yeah, you have a haircut at the barber, dude. I don't know. Oh, headphones. Okay. That makes sense. Let's see. Oh, just missed him. Oop. Bring out my best sin. Oh, no. I missed it. Damn it. Headphones at the barber shop. Shame on you. This guy's going down. Alright. That's fine. You can just whack me with your rock. What do you think I am, you know? You're gonna get discouraged. Alright? I'm gonna continue to pursue you, alright? You can fight back all you want. But I'm gonna kill you. One way or another. Alright, I just knew you were gonna hit me with a rock. It's just messed up, man. But, yeah, headphones. What type of haircut you going for? You're going for a nice one? Then I broke apart parts off of it. Hey, it's wireless. Wireless headphones? What do you wear? AirPods? What's it got? I got Bose ones. Bose earbuds are wireless. They're pretty nice. I like them. They're a little big though. They're a little bit chunky, a little bit thick with that extra C, you know. But hey man, yeah, wireless headphones. Watch the Death Skull come off for this. So, but if you've been missing out on Monster Hunter, man, if you look at the mini map in the left hand corner there, actually, I'm covering it right now. But if I wasn't covering it, that's bad. You can see that he's putting off some Death Skulls. That means he's pretty close to death right now. Ah, I'm just fumbling. Fumbleia. Somebody save me. Bose, ooh, fancy. I would say fancy. And they are pretty fancy, but they're literally like yay thick. Make sure I don't win over the dog on us. I gotta fix this and zoom on this camera right now. But here's the Bose. It's a little hard to see because of my green screen, but not green screen, but my effect. See? Freaking sit out, like out on your ear, like dying. Like, dude, and I get the fancy case, you know, like the AirPods. Yeah, I told you it was thick with 2 C's, bro. Alright. Oh, I totally missed that. Alright, oh well, we'll bring him back.
Oh, I need a bath.
Yeah. Oh. Playing my sound effects is huge. That thing better last forever. I wish it did. It's like 4 hours of battery. I know what you meant. It's fabulous, right? Yeah, unfortunately the battery only lasts 4 hours. It sucks, but you know, it's what you get. I mean, I don't know how long the AirPods last, but I thought they last a little bit longer, to be honest. But I hope that the new ones will be a little bit better. I don't know why they went so thick. I felt like they should have gotten taller. Like, it should, like, got it up and in your ear like this, you know? Instead of, like, here, let me put it out, like, this far from your ears. So when I have a motorcycle. I ride a Suzuki SV6... Is it 620? I want to say 620. Anyways, when I put my helmet on, it freaking knocks those things out of my ears. Or if I actually do get them in, and I put them in my helmet, they're like jabbing needles into my freaking ear holes. I'm like, well, that's sucks, because I bought them because I was like, hey, I can use them when I ride my motorcycle, right? You know, that'd be great. No, I had to buy another set of headphones that went into my helmet. I was it's like, whew. I mean, I could ride without a helmet, but that ain't safe, man. Get a smaller pair. They don't come in a smaller pair. You should be talking about my balls about that, like that, man. Come on, Bon. Oh yeah, that's right. But the return from expedition. Alright, actually, I gotta be honest. I'm really gonna switch over the Call of Duty. I was tempted to sing. It's up to you, Bun. Should I do Twitch sings, or just go on with the rest of my life? Play some COD. I have that problem as well. I mean, the helmet's supposed to be tight, right? No, I mean, it's supposed to be like tight, but not like loose, you know, or pop right off, and then you don't have any protection to. You know what I mean? Twitch Sings. Yeah, Twitch Sings is where you can it's karaoke, but you know, on Twitch. That's all it is. It's nothing special. And then I will play Monster Hunter with my girlfriend once she has a chance to. So come in here and come yell at me. Bob's sitting there trying to do other stuff because I forgot to go help her. All in fairness. But alright, so I don't know. I'm gonna say Twitch Sings when I have more people. I think it's to me a little bit more exciting. That you get to hear me sing crappily and everyone can make fun and at least talk with each other. I'm sitting here dying internally inside. But haircut. Oof. You should post a picture on Discord once you get done. Your haircut. You're shy. But you have Instagram, right? Oh, I should probably turn the music down because I can't even hear myself. Ah, there it goes. So, I was gonna say, maybe on Instagram later. Okay, cool. Do I have you in my Discord? I mean, I can always just get hold of you in Mad Spike. It's fine. But, yeah, man. Yeah, you just followed. So yeah, I know. I got you on Instagram. So I know, I mean Discord. Discord. Sue, that right? Yeah, my Discord. I have a Discord. My Discord is this. I have a Discord. It's called the Dragon's Cavern. I like to welcome you to the Dragon's Cavern. The Dragon's Cavern. That's what I am. That's where I'm at today. Thanks. Yeah. No problem. You can join if you want to. You don't have to. You can join and then mute the whole server. I'm fine. I just figured if you wanna know and enjoy and play, you can. Okay. So I need to switch the game because I almost forgot. Game to Call of Duty. What games do you play, bud? Talk. Warfare. And anime. You watch anime? That's the question. That's the true question. Do you watch an anime? You gotta set up a whole list. All the different. Also Mixer. Why? Because honestly, Mixer is kind of nice. Do I want to say? That's a good question. I'm a person, I like to try everything and see how things are before I just hop out. Ooh. Oh, fun. You like arcade, strategy, and city building. Okay. So arcade would be like Donkey Kong or something, or something else. Yeah, then we gotta. Actually, I think I can do this without getting rid of that. No, I can't do that. Okay. Cool. City building, so SimCity. That's what I can think of. Racing games. Okay. See, wish me luck on this, because it's been pretty tough with you. See, let's do Shoot House. Lately, I've been pretty lucky in Shoot House, getting some nice kills. I've been trying to get this Kansas. I have to get 10 ones. Alright, done with the haircut. Nice. Sweet. Good luck. Thank you. You feel fresh now? You got the fresh haircut? Let's see, God, come on, man. I'm gonna die over here. What's your first game you ever played, Bun? Cause I'm a Zelda nerd. I'm playing Zelda all day. I really should play Link's Awakening. I'm trying to variety my stuff out more. I will do that. Get to that. Hold true to that variety stream. Feel fresh? Yeah, you can say that. I mean, I would just feel fresh after that. You know? Zelda, yes. Cool. Yeah, so. Let's see. Oh, dude. Let's see. Oh. Shot his ass. Oh, crap. I wasn't expecting to run. But Zelda, man. Freaking Ocarina of Time, dude. All day, every day, man. Oh, crap. Wasn't ready for him.
A Trifecta is now following.
Yeah, play. Thank you. Oh, hey, Trifecta. What's going on, man? Thanks for the follow, dude. Can't believe it. Oh, no. I'm about to be blown up. Okay, I survived? I think I survived. Oh, King Fergie, what's up, man? Oh, shot my own teammate. I'm all sorts of fucked over right now. Sorry, guys. Alright. Oh, that's my own teammate once again. But Trifecta, dude, thank you for the follow, man. I wasn't really expecting it, dude. I only hopped in your stream for a bit, man. Man, if my mod was here, she'd be giving you a shout out, dude. That's kind of interesting to watch your channel, dude. And King Fergie stepping in here says, freaking Ocarina of Time, man. I can't tell you how many times me and my sisters beat that game. It's one game that we never like a. All it takes a little bit. Oh, RPG Maker. I've never actually done an RPG. Alright, I'm gonna run past you, dude. Oh, I almost got shot. Alright. See if they notice me. Coming this way. Oh. Nope, I forgot. That's the wrong thing. I gotta. Nice. 2 kills. Oh. Got hit from behind. But dude, thanks, man. Again, Trifecta for the follow. How's your night been, man? How did their RPG making go? Nice, we secured it. Oh, crap. Alright, well, frick that. I'm out of here. Oh, I just saw him. Alright. Oh! What the hell? He just like jumped over me. Oh, okay. Alright. Saved somebody. Been good, had some good progress today. Just a chill stream, dude. Sweet, man. Were you surprised when, was it Retro Joe? I think it is. That, raided you? See, HQ is active. I don't care about HQ. Oh. Let's see where you're gonna. Oh, you got him. Nice, good job. Dude. Your teammates are boss. Yeah, for sure. I didn't realize he was streaming there. No, he hopped on randomly. He wasn't even planning to do it. He looked at his tweets. He was like, "Whoa,
Enemy cluster strike incoming.
nice." All right. Oh man, I didn't mean to fall off. Oh, got hit, per man. Yeah, he was he's messaged on Twitter. He was like, "Hey, you know, I'm hopping on, and it's random, but." Because when he raided you, it was like midnight? Close to midnight for him?
Disabling the enemy HQ.
10 o'clock? Which is random for him. He usually doesn't usually go
HQ secure.
late at night.
Confirming HQ. Stand by to move.
Oh, man. Oh, yeah. I don't know where the next HQ is.
HQ established.
Alright, so over there, okay. Ooh, doo, 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 doo. And he crashed right after for a good reason. He's been busy. I mean, he also had to deal with having a kid. I can't even imagine. You married, Trifecta? Oh! I ran straight into the shotgun. You guys watch that? Bun. Started my Zelda journey with Breath of the Wild. My Switch is broken, so no new year one yet. Got it, okay.
Allied cluster strike.
Oh,
Danger close.
like, I'm watching. Waiting.
Cluster strike.
Okay, they killed him. Yeet. Oh. That's a back alley, but this place is getting blown to pieces, dude. I think, whoa. They're like melting them. Literally. Literally melting them. Captured. Alright, get the hell out! Because once you capture it, you're freaking stuck. Oh. Oh, frick! Oh, man. Yes. Alright, so once you can't spawn, you can't spawn, bud. There you go. So. Anyways. How long have you been playing RPG Maker? Africa. Trifecta. I can't even think.
Locating the HQ. Get ready to move.
Brain fart, man. That was my sound effect. I apologize. It likes to go off.
New HQ established.
Alright. See. Oh, great. Someone like right in front of me. To the left too. Yeah, I've been doing RPG Maker stuff since high school. I'm on and off, but this particular project about 2 years. Okay, okay. Weren't you talking in Oh crap! I almost died. All right, they took him out for me.
We're at the HQ. Stand by.
This is a terrible game to talk and play at the same time, but I enjoy it. And the other games you play are have you just been doing RPG Maker, like creating game? Oh, some lag. Oh man. Oh. Let's see. Oh, 2 years. Congrats on the 2 years. But I'm just died. Where will my teammates be at? Oh, okay. I deserve that. I shouldn't have jumped in the middle of them. Smoky Bar. Ooh, he's got 32 kills, man. Freaking crazy. Alright. Throw that over. Gonna run. Oh, nice! That freaking sucks from them, but I'll take it. Oh, Claymore, didn't I? Yep, they got me Claymored. I'm currently doing a JRPG, Trials on Mana. Oh, on Monday and Tuesday, Thursdays are wild card day where I just play. Okay, let me fill up. Okay. So, enemy at the junkyard? That's over that way.
New HQ established.
Oh man, these guys are on it today. Check fire, check fire. Oh. Alright. I expected him to see me. That's what I thought. I thought he was gonna see me. Training grounds.
Enemy UAV online.
Oh.
Lock it down. They're capturing the HQ.
Oh, I thought I got it, dude. Okay, so I have to check it out. I haven't seen Trials of Mana, but I think I would enjoy that trifecta. Watch them. Once again, thanks for popping in, dude. Oh. See.
We're disabling the HQ.
Yeah. Stabled.
Taking the HQ. Locating the HQ.
Oh, I see him now. Yeah. Let's see. Oh man. Alright, so. You play D&D at all? Trifecta? Because I was playing this game today. Of course, I'll be looking in a bit since it's time for you to crash as well. Oh, no problem, dude. I'm not. I'm not full of energy myself. I honestly probably get off a little bit. Okay. Well, don't run back. I'm fine with that. Enemy UAV? Oh, so crap. I got assist for that? Nice. I don't play actively currently, but I do love chatting about it. Okay. Yeah, dude, I just started up. I'm new to D&D right now. And tonight we had something crazy happen. So it's our third session? Our third session? So we're in a dungeon. And we're all level 1. All of us are new except for one guy who plays Pathfinder. So he decided to give D&D a try. And here, we'll just take it to just chatting, because I know after this I'm done. Ooh. So I've been pretty tired. It's been a long day. My brain is farting. Alright. So. Charizard. Anyways. D&D. I'm a rogue. My girlfriend's a druid. And, we have a bard and a barbarian. Well, the 4 of us are trying to take this hobgoblin, right? Just struggling to take this hobgoblin out. We're getting okay rolls, whatever. Anyways, we finally take him out, find out he's level 3 to our level 1, okay? So we get through the more of the dungeon, and we run into like 40 goblins. Like, it was like 10 group of 4. Yeah, so 10 groups of 4 goblins, and 1 goblin shaman. And we're like, oh, dude. Like, my girlfriend's like, we should just run. We just leave. We don't need to go in there. It's fine. And I was like, I saw the boxes. I was like, because I'm rogue. I went stealthy, right? So I went stealthy. I found all this, right? And we go in. I go in and I'm looking at it, and I open one of the treasure boxes in there. It was a bunch of gold. And he's like, the DM's like, you can't get those because you're going to alert the goblins. You know, I was like, oh, freak. Okay. All right. Well, I'm like, hey guys, let's just take one of the groups out at a time. And we have Flexel. Flexel's our barbarian, and then Iffy is our bard. And they're like, yeah, that sounds good. You know, maybe we'll do that. And Sam's like, what's my girlfriend, the druid. She's like, why don't we just use fart and we'll just block all the goblins from being able to see us while we get the treasure and stuff. And we do that, and then me and the after we get all the treasure, me and the barbarian's like, hey, let's get the shaman. Maybe we take the shaman out. You know, maybe all the goblins leave, right? So we're fighting. We drag the shaman through the fog, brought him over, started fighting him. Our barbarian's a snake beast, and he wraps around and just holds him, so the shaman can't do anything. And we're just taking shots at him the whole entire time, just beating him up, and we beat him. And I got to find out he had 92 health, and he was level 7 to our level 1. Our DM's like, whoa, you guys just beat this? I can't even just... He's like, I knew there might be a chance, because it's D&D, right? Right? So now he has to name 90 items, because we opened all the chests, and there's 90 items in all those chests. And, I rolled successfully as a rogue to, like, break into all the treasure chests, so I get all of it. But, it was pretty dope. It was a great time. It was like third time freaking playing D&D, and we're sitting here breaking the game. Just dying, dude. I was like, well, how in the hell do like 4 level 1s take on a level 7 and survive it? Freaking legend. Yeah. Then had the barbarian not been able to wrap him up, it would have been probably a different story. But, and the girlfriend for the amazing fart flog that she put out. And they last for hours, so it's like they don't know where we're at. The fog denses some of the noise, so they can't hear us, Let's just beat him to death. It's so brutal. Just sat there poking him with my sword. And Sam was throwing pebbles. She can take, as a druid, she can take pebbles and magic them. So she's like throwing magic pebbles at him. Here, take this, take this. And she's like, rolling 12s, which was like the bare minimum of actually hitting him, and like rolling like out 8 for damage. And it was a good time. It was freaking hilarious. And we actually woke up one of the other members who was supposed to be with us, so he could get some of the XP. Because we're like, dude, now I went from level 1 to level 3, and we're only in our 3rd session in. Freaking done. But hey, Trifecta, I'm gonna call it the night, man. I hope you have a good night's sleep, dude. Take it easy. I can keep you up all night talking about silly stuff, but hey, take it easy again. Have a good night. And thank you for the follow.